So good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for showing up this morning at 9 a.m. on a Friday for the last day of Peace Week. This is Peace Week, organized by the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution here at George Mason University. Each semester, the Carter School Peace Week brings together faculty, students, and alumni, as well as friends and partners from across the peace and conflict resolution community for a week-long conversation around how to effectively address urgent issues of peace and justice. And the theme for this year's, or for the Fall Peace Week, because this does happen in the fall and in the spring, is building peace in partnership. Our session today is a multidisciplinary panel that's looking to build and nurture partnerships between those of us here in the peace and conflict community and our colleagues who are currently working in the ever-advancing and dynamic field of neuroscience. And we'd like to explore the interdisciplinary overlap together and start a conversation about how our fields can continue to work together, both now and as things change and develop into the future. My name is Kristen Fagan. I'm wrapping up my master's degree here at the Carter School. I'll finish in December. It's been an absolute pleasure. One of the honors of my life to work with these fine colleagues. And I study empathy and compassion-based interventions, as well as family narrative intervention and how those two fields kind of work together and inform one another. I also work in private practice with families working to build more collaborative and respectful relationships. And to learn how to together write better stories. I'd like to introduce my colleagues here. And I want to give a little bit more time for introductions than maybe we usually do in these sessions that are typically so rushed, just to make sure that we have a good sense of where everyone's kind of working from, what their background is, and what their lens into this discussion is. So I'm going to go ahead and start with Dr. Gopin. Mark, tell us about your work.
Hi, it's wonderful to meet all of you online, and some of you are old friends. My trajectory in this work has been, a number of decades of work in the field in terms of conflict resolution in war zones, dealing with very traumatized people, people who have a great deal of difficulty on a personal level with conflict situations. My background is coming to this from a deep focus on religion and philosophy and world religions and all their diversity in terms of both violence and peace, and trying to integrate them into the larger world of diplomacy and conflict resolution. But I took an interest in neuroscience in the last 20 years of focusing on the psychosocial elements that destroy peace processes or actually make them quite possible, and especially the inner workings of the human mind on compassion and reasoning, moral reasoning. And of late, I'm very, very interested in the default network of imagination and future thinking. So all of these things interest me, and I apply them to in places where people are excited about neuro, but they don't know much about it. And I love this translation between fields. Anyways, it's wonderful to meet all of you. And Dr. Klimecki was one of the main inspirations for my move into this field of neuroscience.
Thanks, Mark. We'll go ahead and jump on that segue and let Dr. Klimecki introduce herself.
Thank you. And I actually prepared some few content slides to talk about this work. I think we share this passion for looking at how neuroscience can provide us with information how to resolve conflicts. And I found this image that I find quite exciting, because we not only have a brain, but we have a brain that connects to other people, that kind of works out on the information that we receive from others, and that guides our behaviors, right? So when I work on the neuroscience of conflict resolution and on understanding others, there's some key terms that we use. And one of them is empathy, which means sharing others' emotions. So I can share another person's joy or sadness or anger. And then when it comes to sharing the suffering of others, I can share suffering and respond with empathic distress, which means I'm overwhelmed by the suffering of others, or I could respond with compassion, which means I care and am benevolent and am motivated to help others who are suffering. And then there's also perspective taking, which is a cognitive understanding of the thoughts and intentions of others. And when we look at this, it seems to me that there might be a kind of model where compassion, positive emotions, and social connectedness promote helping behavior and reduce aggressive behavior, and they're also linked to brain regions like medial orbital frontal cortex and striatum, so brain regions here in red in that image, and these brain regions are malleable. We can train those through very brief interventions already, even in adults. And then there's also another kind of system which is characterized by feelings of distress, negative emotions, social disconnectedness, that is associated with less helping and more aggressive behavior, and with activations in areas like anterior cingulate cortex here and anterior insula. And maybe two more words on the relation between social emotions, social behavior, and brain functions and their malleability. So we know that empathy inductions can promote prosocial behavior, and that the empathy felt is linearly associated to the helping behavior that participants show. We also know that compassion and perspective taking, as well as activations in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, a region here that's very important for the regulation of emotions, predict an inhibition of later punishment behavior. And we know that interventions like mediation can improve conflict resolution and can strengthen activations in brain areas like the nucleus accumbens, which is part of the striatum, so part of this compassion and positive emotions network. And what I learned as well in my work on conflict resolution is that it's not always good to do direct interventions aimed at promoting empathy or perspective taking, because when I did a study on people who are pro and anti-immigration in Switzerland, I found that these interventions can backfire in people who are against immigration. And so what we do these days is we do indirect interventions, for instance with compassion training, where we don't tell the people that they'll apply this training to conflict, and it seems to work. So it can increase feelings of closeness, for instance, towards difficult persons, especially in the work environment. It can increase satisfaction with conflict discussions in couples and decrease their compliance, which is good, so they stand in for their needs. And it could increase closeness and pro-social behavior of Israelis towards Palestinians. And currently we're trying to scale this up and also do comparative studies on social emotional education across the world, including younger people. And I'd also, of course, like to thank the team involved in doing this work, because this is not work that I'm doing on my own. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Boy, I already have a million questions, but that's okay. We'll hold those for later. Dr. Ramos, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Kristen, for inviting me to be part of this discussion. So I just will say a bit about my background. I'm a neuroscientist by training, but I haven't been a functional neuroscience working at the bench for many years now. I have a longstanding interest in and experience with ethics, specifically neuroethics, or the ethics of neuroscience and neurotechnology. So I worked at the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH, from 2012 through 2021 as part of various teams that essentially oversee making grants to neuroscience researchers. And a major component of this was something called the NIH Brain Initiative, which is focused on developing really incredible new neurotechnologies that will allow us to work towards understanding the neural basis of perception, emotion, cognition, and behavior. That was the sort of stated goal of the Brain Initiative. And ultimately, the idea is to allow us to precisely intervene when these brain functions are disrupted in conditions of illness or injury. So that's sort of the premise of that large neurotechnology research endeavor that I was working on. And when this initiative started, we knew that those kinds of abilities would raise a lot of ethical, legal, and societal implications if you could actually do those things. Questions like who should have access to these technologies? Will they give some people unfair advantage? How do we think about side effects? And there's so many different kinds of side effects that can result. And who is really responsible for raising and answering these questions? So I worked to essentially build a framework and infrastructure for the NIH Brain Initiative to substantively engage with these questions, along with funding the neuroscience research. So as part of the work I did, we funded neuroethics research. We convened experts to really kind of continuously review the work, the neurotechnology work that we were supporting, help us identify these questions, convene workshops on these topics. We wrote papers, and that work has continued since my departure from NIH, but it was a really tremendous experience to be able to see, what are the cutting edge things that the top neuroscientists, are working on, and how are we going to proactively engage with these ethical, legal, and societal issues. So about a year and a half ago, I left NIH to work for an organization called the Dana Foundation. And I want to share just really brief slides, in part so I can show this beautiful new branding that we have just unveiled. And also, of course, to say a bit about what the Dana Foundation is and does, because this is especially germane to this conversation. So basically, we are a private nonprofit foundation in New York City, and our whole premise since late 2020 is this idea of envisioning brain science for a better future. So our vision comes from the recognition that science and advances in science can produce both salutary and negative effects on human well-being and flourishing. We have so many examples from history of this. And so our focus is to advance neuroscience that benefits society and reflects the aspirations of all people. And I could say a lot more about, the sort of genesis of this focus, but for now, what I really wanted to focus on just in the last moment here is the grant making that we do. So we are a grant making foundation, and we have 3 grant program areas. We can start at the bottom here, the brainstem. So we have a program focused on education. We are interested in supporting education around neuroscience and the ways that it interfaces with our everyday lives, including through peacebuilding, which is something that is new to me, actually. Our second program area is called the Dana Next Gen program. This one is focused on training a new generation of what we call neuroscience and society scholars and practitioners who can shepherd neuroscience uses for a better world. And already I'm just thinking about how this is an area where we could imagine trying to support training neuroscience and society scholars and practitioners working at the interface of neuroscience and peacebuilding, which is a really exciting possibility that we haven't engaged with at the foundation before. And at the top, we have the Dana Frontiers program that's focused on increasing engagement with neuroscience among diverse publics to deepen trust and inform policy. And the idea here is that we really need to open the field of neuroscience up to everyone. Neuroscience should be for everybody. And that has not traditionally been the case. We need new methodologies to bring people in to understand how different communities and societies really want neuroscience to be used in their lives, and then use that input to actually inform decision-making in neuroscience and in policy making that's based on neuroscience. So this is all very new for us still, but it's really exciting to continue to be able to work at the interface of neuroscience and society, which is what I've always been interested in, even when I was a graduate student. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that background on Dana's kind of breadth of scope, and congratulations on the new branding. It's beautiful. Dr. Rein, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work?
Please, yes. So thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here on stage among these extremely distinguished panelists. So it's very exciting. So yes, my name is Ben. I'm also a neuroscientist by training. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford University. My interests have always been in social behavior and, looking around a cafeteria. I can remember in middle school and noticing, why there were tables of students who were loud and boisterous and touching each other, and there's all this social energy, and then there were other tables where people were kind of sitting on their phones or reading books, or I'm not sure if people had phones back then, but sitting quietly, not engaging with one another. And so I've always been interested in that sort of divergence, and so I studied autism spectrum disorder in my PhD, and really got into the molecular neurobiology and genetics of autism, and now I've sort of, if you consider social behavior as sort of a continuum or a spectrum, I've shifted to this extreme upper end of that spectrum and looking at how MDMA, or this drug, it's also known as Molly or ecstasy, it's known for increasing social connection, but studying the mechanism of how that creates that extreme social connection and empathy. And so we're using an animal model, an animal behavioral assay of empathy to identify on a sort of systems and molecular neuroscience level what brain mechanisms are involved. And that's unpublished, but I'm happy to talk about it here. So aside from my research, I'm also a science communicator. I go on the internet and social media and do my best to connect the public with scientific research and really take it to any level. So I found that the general public is perhaps a bit frustrated about the accessibility of science, and that it's often behind paywalls. And once you reach behind those paywalls, it's very difficult to interpret. It's full of jargon. And so I've found a great need from the public, or a great interest in, short 60-second videos where I take some neuroscience research that I find exciting, and break it down and provide a simple interpretable message. And it's gone great. And so I'm very fortunate to be involved in that, and really grateful for the response that I've received from the public. And I find it very exciting. I'm really passionate about both science and science communication. And so I'm very grateful to be here and looking forward to this discussion.
Well, terrific. Thank you so much for introducing yourself. The way that we're going to run kind of our panel today is I'm going to pose some questions. There's obviously a lot of overlap in everyone's specialties and research areas, but everybody has their own kind of specific interests. So I may ask these questions to specific members of the panel, but please feel free to jump in if you have thoughts or you'd like to add anything. We're going to try to cover a lot of ground today, a lot of different types of questions. So, and feel free to chat with one another. We love that kind of engagement. So, to kind of lay the groundwork, and actually, Dr. Klimecki, I'll send this to you because you talked about some of these in your introduction. Okay, how would you sum up our best understanding right now of the neurology of compassion and empathy, and how they work in the brain? It's a very general question, I know.
Yeah, but so what we found, and fortunately I had a slide about this, is that these can be differentiated. So we can see different patterns underlying a more empathic response, which goes with negative emotions and suffering with, and then more compassionate response, which goes with more benevolence, and which also has these key activations in the orbital frontal cortex and striatum. And these areas are not just important for reward and learning, but also for integrating emotions into action. So, and what I find also exciting is that these brain functions are malleable. So even as adults, when we do short trainings of just a few days, we can strengthen the activity in these networks, and this goes along with more pro-social behavior. So I think, yeah, what I find very exciting about this is that it's malleable, and we can distinguish it, and that might give us some ideas on how to move forward.
Dr. Rein, do you have anything to add about that? Any thoughts about your observations so far, or where you see this going?
Well, I think it's extremely interesting what Dr. Klimecki said about, differentiating the neural responses to sort of empathic distress versus compassion. I think it's very telling, and I might even ask her to elaborate a little bit further on that. But I think, from my understanding, and as her slide showed, the anterior cingulate cortex, the insula, are largely activated by viewing others in distress and pain. I guess this is a discussion, it's a panel. Dr. Klimecki, can I ask you to speak a little bit more about those two sort of distinct patterns you've observed?
Yeah, so for instance, for the anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, we know from meta-analyses that these are regions involved in empathy for pain. We also know that these are regions active in pain perception for oneself. So we guess that you kind of feel the pain of others by simulating it. And at the same time, these are key parts of the salience network, right? So the salience network, Margot just talked about the default mode network. So the salience network is a brain network that's active whenever something important is happening. So voila, here we have that importance attached to negative stimuli. Is that sufficient of an answer for now, or?
Yeah, we can dive much deeper into this later on. Yes, well, we'll get back to this.
Is that something that you're seeing in your research too, as you look in your animal models and you're observing their response? Is there are there connections to be made there? Is that something that's been reinforced in your individual observations?
Yeah, so it's, without getting too deep into the phenomenology of what we're studying, the behavioral assay that is used, scientist Monique Smith, Dr. Monique Smith, she's at UC San Diego now, was formerly in the lab here at Stanford. She discovered that when you have two mice together for about an hour, well, for exactly an hour, we are scientists, and one is experiencing an inflammatory pain in one paw and the other is not, the other is healthy, the healthy mouse will start to behave as if they're in pain. They will start to display increased sensitivity in their paw as if they had experienced this inflammation. And so that she termed this the social transfer of pain. And it's a very interesting model of empathy because it's exactly, this idea of empathy, that it's sharing the adoption of another's state. What's really fascinating is that she also demonstrated the social transfer of analgesia, where if you have two mice in pain and one is experiencing analgesia, they've received morphine, the other mouse will actually alleviate the pain for a short time in the other mouse. So both these positive and negative physical experiences can be transferred through a social interaction. And what she found in her research is that the anterior cingulate cortex is critical. So if you use a advanced neuroscience technique called optogenetics to silence the neurons during the testing, the mice will no longer show this effect. And this is in the anterior cingulate cortex, I'm sorry. So silencing these glutamatergic neurons in the ACC can block the effect, which of course aligns with the human research suggesting that the ACC is critical in the empathy for pain or the observation of pain in a conspecific. So now what I'm doing is building off of the previous research and using the same model to identify, when we give MDMA to the mice, does it enhance this effect? Does it, which, spoiler alert, of course, since I'm here, the answer is yes, it does enhance the effect. And the next question, of course, and the important question is how? What's it doing in the brain? And I can answer that now, but we can maybe get into that later. I feel like this gets really into the sort of neuroethics and this enhancement question of what happens, when we discover pharmacological approaches that could enhance empathy directly through specified mechanisms. So I'll maybe save that for later on.
Keep us in
Can I ask a more very basic question? I'm just curious, both in the animal models and the human research, whether there are any sex differences.
In the animals, there are no sex differences in this basic social transfer of pain effect. Both males and females show it. It does get a little bit complicated. I've had trouble seeing this effect, me personally, with the MDMA enhancement in both males and females. But there is some human research that's sort of messy, suggesting that MDMA only enhances empathy in males and not females, but there's other reports conflicting with that. So there are some reports that would support what I found in mice and others that would not. But the other complicated factor is that the odors and presence of a male experimenter can affect the way female mice display pain behaviors, which may be affecting our results. So it becomes very complicated. But in humans, as far as I know, females show greater empathic responses. Dr. Klimecki, please correct me or confirm.
No, I agree. So we observe more empathy, more compassion ratings by females. We also, as research by some colleagues, showing differences in brain activations of male and female humans on empathy. It's hard to say whether this is a real effect or whether this is a reporting bias, because maybe men are kind of trained to underreport their compassion or empathy. So it's very, very hard to say all those things, but we do observe differences in humans, yes.
Okay, so I feel like we've got a little bit of a basis for those of us who are not experts in this area. Dr. Klimecki, we'll come back to you for this. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what we know about what circumstances or triggers tend to evoke this compassionate response in people?
Yeah, so there are, I mean, apart from the training that we do, because when we train people in compassion, we use a meditative training, but also there we start with some triggers, and then everyone is a bit different, so everyone may have a preference for one trigger or the other. So, for instance, in the contemplative tradition, you evoke it by thinking of a person or an animal who's dear to you. And actually, many participants think of animals because, for instance, their cat very rarely did something horrible to them, apart from maybe scratching the couch. So, you know, you think of maybe your grandmother, your parents, your best friend, your siblings, whatever. You have your cat. So this is this memory of another loving being, and then there's this connection to the feeling, which is very important, right? And some people can connect to their feelings very well, others not so much. So it's very individual and can also fluctuate over time within individuals, of course. So connecting to the feeling is another aspect. And then in the contemplative tradition, there are phrases that are being used, right? So wishes of well-being. And so in some of these traditions, when we train more the aspect of loving kindness, it's sentences like, may you be well, may you be happy. And for compassion is, may I, for instance, if I do it for myself, is may I have compassion with my suffering, or may I be benevolent with myself in times that are hard, and so on, right? So these are phrases that can help. And I think it's good to offer a multitude of pathways to enter this compassionate state, because, as I said, it fluctuates between individuals and within individuals of what works better. Yeah.
So I just want to follow up quickly, because I know you mentioned in your introduction that personal motivation for conflict resolution, for resolving the conflict, is important in order to see success with these types of interventions. And one of your bullet points touched briefly on Israel and Palestine. Are you able to speak a little bit to how kind of our observed neuroscience understanding intersects with the very old idea of kind of contact theory, and how those things interact? I know that wasn't a question that we talked about, but it seems.
No, and I'm not sure what is context theory. Can you tell me?
Yeah, the idea that exposure to people who are different than you, simply by being near them, that will help increase empathy just by spending time together.
Oh, intergroup contact theory. Oh, this one. Okay, this one I know.
Yeah.
Well, intergroup contact theory. I can tell you a lot about that, but
I know.
You know, this is, but just very briefly, and that's a very important thing. So the intergroup contact theory is a very ancient theory dating back to the 40s and 50s, and being very prominent in social psychology. A recent meta-analysis by our colleague Elizabeth Pallock and other colleagues has shown that intergroup contact may not be so efficient after all. So you know about that. And I think that's a very important finding, because also some studies, like there is a science paper showing that just intergroup contact in a post-war area in Iraq doesn't necessarily improve intergroup relations beyond just the football setting where this intergroup contact happens. So that's a very important message, I think, and not only there are other fields of social psychology where we were trying to replicate standard paradigms in different countries with studies with hundreds of participants, and we fail. And I just came back from a conference I attended 2 weeks ago, and many of my colleagues were reporting, well, we just cannot replicate these findings, and we never published that. And I thought, well, maybe there's actually something to it, that we may have to rethink some of the very basic paradigms that we always took for granted for decades, right? So intergroup contact may not just work. And currently what I really found very instructive, both for me and for the field as a whole, is that these indirect interventions may be a good way forward, where we do not tell people, look, we're trying to make you solve your problem with your neighbor or your problem with the people from another country, but we just tell them, look, we think, having compassion for yourself, or we think feeling healthy might be good for you, so maybe we want to engage in that training, and then potentially they will transfer what they learn in that training, that kind of benevolence for all beings, maybe they will transfer that to others. So that's the main idea. And there's not just my research that suggests that these direct interventions don't work and the indirect interventions work better. There's a whole bunch of researchers in Israel who tend to find that very consistently, that the indirect way to regulate emotions to then promote conflict resolution by transfer works very well, and that aligns with psychotherapeutical traditions, which also, I mean, you're the expert on these, right? You also don't just tell your patients, look, I think you'd better make friends with your parents, but you kind of ask questions where you make them think and make them realize, oh yeah, maybe I could do that, maybe I could do this, and it more comes from them, but you kind of plant the seeds.
Thank
I'd like to comment on that in terms of practice, since I've spent about 30, 40 years working in Israel and Palestine and the Middle East in general. And contact theory was grossly misapplied and misunderstood. Gordon Alpert and Martin Buber did not have in mind conferences for contact. And as a matter of fact, I've been asked to and participated in conferences where the agenda was to deliberately provoke anger. The hidden agenda was to see how enemies react to extremely evocative, painful issues. To think that that kind of contact would lead to transformation of relationship was laughable. And it was never true to the original notion of contact, which was transformative, relationship oriented. So that, for example, our metrics have been entirely wrong. I've proposed metrics such as how many people have cried after the event, how many people hugged, how many people actually slept in the house of somebody who was their enemy, and that kind of contact. How many people ate together or sang together? It turns out that singing, which has lots of neuroscience interest, an alignment of brain waves, turns out to be a complete transformation of many diplomacy moments that were disastrous until they sang together. So there's all sorts of things here about contact that have been bastardized by monetary approaches to conferences and the metrics of how many people we have who met each other, etc. And certainly negative contact, which actually, I'll never forget being at a conference where somebody got up and said, you know, I thank the conference members because I didn't understand exactly why I hated them. Now I understand. So imagine the disaster of that kind of contact that actually creates the hatred that people couldn't quite name until the contact. So, and then to answer Olga's very astute comment on, this is exactly what we do in practice, is that the whole point is that the therapeutic approach, which does not confront the conflict,
right.
is transformative and immediately internalized by people into a shift in how they're thinking and talking about their enemies. But
Right.
you don't do it. And this is what we practice by the thousands, both secular and religious approaches to peace building, where you don't confront the immediate conflict. It's only the rationalistic elite diplomacy that focuses on the conflict constantly. And at night, when they drink together or whatever they do, then suddenly they're astonished that that's where it works out. So this idea that the focus on something actually would produce the results is a misunderstanding of how the mind works and the heart and the relationship of emotion. So the other thing is that self-awareness, which I'd like to do more, is that the self-awareness of empathic distress and the metabolics of cortisol and burnout versus the enthusiasm of compassion. When I teach this, and I've taught it now to thousands of people in Syria and other places, it's revolutionary to them that they can have control over, and this is about moral agency, which is allergic in science circles, but actually Seligman and others are trying to bring it back. And that is that instead of psychopharmacology, which still teach the person as an object, the power of me knowing that I can exercise my brain towards compassionate health and joy in helping somebody is changing the psychopharmacology completely. And I think we need to explore the consequences of that. And this is where science communication becomes important, because it's how you explain to people that they've actually strengthened the part of their brain for compassionate action that gives them agency, that gives them strength and self-awareness. So where does self-awareness come into the brain and move things in a direction of what we used to call free will, the taking control? So this is a very interesting aspect of science education, and also the neural pathways and plasticity that we can actually change without a single drug. That's what's exciting here.
Thank you so much for bringing that back around. That's quite exactly it. It's contact theory, social intergroup contact theory is such a kind of a gross understanding of the way that people interact, and it feels like our emerging understanding of the way these emotions and processes work in the brain is helping to disprove and refine our understanding of what happens when people are together and sharing emotional space. Dr. Klimecki was pretty clear that she feels that this region of the brain is trainable, that it's neuroplastic, and these are skills that we can improve. And we were talking about how we've seen positive impact from those types of training interventions. Dr. Gopin, you want to talk a little bit about some of the approaches that you've used for that? I know Dr. Klimecki mentioned loving kindness or meta training. I know you've written about other approaches as well. But Dr. Gopin, how about you?
Well, what we do in the field is very, I have my own methods of just getting people to be self-aware of their capacity to emerge. So I have an 8-step process that begins with self-examination and then moves on to a consciousness of the power of emotion, both negatively and positively. And I move on to the use of the word, the use of imagination. I'm particularly interested in positive psychology's contribution to the shift in questions that people ask of the present and future, and the future orientation. That's why I mentioned the default network, because the default network is an area of the mind that, as non-scientists, it seems like they're discovering the space in which we do planning and alternatives and imaginations that is active. My students were blown away yesterday that precisely when you're not doing anything, there's a part of your brain that's the most active. So it gave them the power to think that, oh, my sleep matters, my reverie matters, and my dreaming of the future matters. And that's a power. So when you're dealing with people in war zones where you can't think about anything but loss in many situations, to even entertain the idea of just the question that evokes from the brain, what would you do now if you could? What would you do? So we ask this to people who are victims, and sometimes it's very painful to hear what they would do. So they would say, I'd go back 2 miles and bury my wife because I had to leave her by the side of the road. I mean, this is very bad stuff.
Right.
But the fact is that when people can imagine what they would do, it gives them some power, because then you move therapeutically. Well, if you can't, what would be the best way to memorialize her? Or what would you do in the future, seeing as you can't go back and stay alive? So these were terrible moments as practitioners that we have to face. But thanks to, really, thanks to key doctors in my life, emergency room doctors, and Dr. Klimecki's work on compassionate action, and the Dalai Lama, and so much training, Mahagosananda, I've been able to take those moments and shift the questions therapeutically towards, what do you want to do? The future orientation, which is what I'm going to be writing about more next, is because the future questions seem to give power to other parts of the brain that are more healthy than obsession with the past. So empathy is it's the empathy versus compassion is such a subtle thing, and that's what we explore in the trainings. And sometimes religious values, religious texts, all sorts of things, music can push you towards the compassionate response versus the rage and empathy and burnout of, I'm done, I don't want to live. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's kind of what we're doing in the field, and it's kind of messy, but but it works. I swear to God, it works for a lot of people.
I've had the pleasure of seeing you work, so I can vouch for that. I've seen the impact you've had on people. Yes, Dr. Klimecki, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very inspired by the work you do, and I'm wondering, because we've been doing some research on the default mode network actually, and we just published a paper earlier this year in Nature Aging with one of my PhD students, where we showed that the connectivity between the default mode network, particularly with the posterior parts, so with the posterior cingulate cortex and the amygdala, when nothing is happening, so after high emotional films, so they see the suffering of others, but then nothing is happening, and those participants who have a higher connectivity between the default mode network and the amygdala also have more negative thoughts, more rumination, more anxiety. So I guess that your interventions would reduce this connectivity and maybe lead to a different kind of connectivity. And we also found in another yet unpublished study that there might be some kind of good connectivity of the default mode network with more prefrontal regions. So I'd be interested maybe further down the road, and this is one of the topics we're currently exploring, is whether the trainings in compassion or other trainings also change connectivities of the default mode network to more wholesome kind of connectivities.
Yeah, 2 seconds. I would recommend the fMRI's focus on people, on positive questions from in a therapeutic environment. In other words, when people are connecting the amygdala to their reveries and it's very, very negative, what questions, while an fMRI is going, evoke a different part of the brain that imagines something more healthy, that releases less cortisol, but more of the psychopharmacology that is associated with compassion and happiness. And I've seen it work, but I can't prove it with an fMRI yet. That every question, philosophy for thousands of years has said the question is the key to enlightenment, not the answers. And so the question seems to release the power if it's the right kind of question that focuses on it's a very therapeutic process, but I'd like to see the fMRI studying the effects of questions.
Lots left to discover there for sure. I want to take us in a slightly different direction here briefly, because one of the things that we think about a lot as peace practitioners is the ethics of our involvement, of our intervention in all types of different situations. As we learn and understand more about the brain, how empathy and compassion-based interventions act in the brain, it puts us at a bit of a knowledge advantage over many of the populations with whom we may be working. And we're kind of at a precipice in terms of the rapid development of neurotech and neuroscience-based interventions. So with this rise in neurotech, I'd like to hear maybe first from Dr. Ramos about what we see as the ethical concerns, perhaps, in intentionally evoking what's essentially understood as a biological response in some people. So whether it's compassion or empathy or empathic distress, can just give us a little bit of background on that and the idea kind of moral enhancement generally as we talk about compassion training?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think, as you just said, I think your question is essentially a version of asking whether it's ethical to morally enhance people. And maybe more specifically, whether it would be ethical to morally neuro-enhance people. So I think, there's a question here around what do we mean by the neuro piece? Because if we're thinking about sort of neural-based interventions that would augment the moral status of the person you're intervening on, there's so many types of neural interventions that could be used, but I'm just going to set that aside for the moment because that's a whole conversation in and of itself. But just to try to answer the question, we can imagine that we could use our understanding of the neurobiology of compassion to stimulate the brain in some way to sort of augment that ability to experience compassion. And I think the question is, would that be ethical? So the first thing I will say is that I'm not an expert in this. I did read a little bit about this in preparation for this panel, and there are many scholars in philosophy and ethics who have written a lot about the ethics of moral neuroenhancement, including people like Julian Savulescu, David DeGrazia. So I think a few points. One, the first thing is that it's very unclear if this would even be possible. And there's much more granularity to be explored in terms of like what we would actually be targeting: motives, behavior, character traits. And this is something that people have discussed extensively. I think there's also a distinction between the idea of making somebody a morally better agent, able to flexibly respond and make decisions, you know, in any given context, versus trying to augment a particular type of moral functioning. That's a distinction also that would matter. So I think there are these kind of maybe questions about what is or isn't possible. The second major point I would say is that, not surprisingly, philosophers and ethicists are really in disagreement about the moral permissibility of the idea of moral neuroenhancement. You know, you have a full spectrum of opinions. Some argue that we actually have an ethical imperative to try to develop these kinds of moral neuroenhancements. Some say that it might be morally permissible to intervene on people in this way. Some think it would even be morally desirable. But there are, of course, a lot of concerns that people have discussed, including the ideas of reduced autonomy or, you know, individual freedom, the idea that there might be an outcome of somehow superficial moral improvement. There's certainly the risk of misuse of any kind of real ability to, you know, enhance human function in whatever way. There's also the potential direct risk to the person, again, depending on the type of neuro intervention we're talking about. If, for instance, you were physically implanting something in somebody to stimulate their brain, there's obviously physical risks. Also, some people argue about the idea that moral neuroenhancement could be beneficial to society, but not the enhanced person. There's potential risks at group levels. And I think, you know, Kristen, we've talked about this before. A really fundamental point here is the notion of epistemic humility. And this is true when we're thinking about any kind of neuro intervention. The brain is incredibly complicated and we don't know what would really happen. It's almost never as straightforward. I would say it's never as straightforward as it seems. And some have actually argued that neuro intervention to enhance morality could even backfire and cause moral deterioration. So, you know, I think at the same time, another thing to consider, and this has already been discussed, is that we partake in different activities to morally enhance ourselves with some frequency and have been doing that for millennia, right? Whether it's through education, meditation's been mentioned, spiritual ceremonies like with ayahuasca, for instance. And so I think part of the question is what would be different about essentially taking a shortcut to moral enhancement with neurotechnology? And here's where I want to zoom out a little bit and anchor more in my expertise, which is that this general question of sort of taking shortcuts with neurotechnology to enhance human functioning is something that's debated in the neuroethics space regarding cognitive enhancement, right? So would it be ethical to use neurotechnology to enhance your attention, for instance? I mean, people do that all the time with caffeine, Adderall. So what's different about using neurotechnology? And one of the things that we frequently talk about is that, at least in theory, neurotechnology could give you the ability to intervene precisely in time and space. And there's something potentially different about that kind of an immediate change versus more sort of facilitative effect that would be possible if you, for instance, drink coffee and couple that with your own effort and agency, you know, over time. So, you know, I think there's so much here, and you know, there's so much literature on these questions. But I think maybe the last point I want to make is that the answers to these questions cannot come from scientists alone. They cannot come from ethicists alone or philosophers alone. This is where we come back to one of the primary focuses of the Dana Foundation, which is this point about public engagement. I just so fundamentally believe that we have to understand societal goals and human values when considering how we want to use neurotechnology or any kind of advance in science in general. And as I was saying earlier, we should be leveraging that engagement to inform policy regarding how neurotechnology is regulated. And it'd be interesting to think about how that applies in this space. But the last thing I wanted to mention is that just last month, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, PCAST, released a set of recommendations where they're essentially saying, they believe that federal agencies involved in science should be developing public policies that are informed not just by science, but also by community values and priorities. So, this is not like PCAST recommendations don't instantly become reality, but it's really interesting to me that this is the track we're on. I really think this is where we're headed. And the thing is, though, to do that, we really need new models for that kind of engagement with publics on, where are we going with our scientific abilities, and what this is really like the question of what should we do versus what can we do.
Well, I think hopefully we've got a start to that here, just kind of enjoying some cross-disciplinary conversation and trying to make this a public conversation where we can learn from other people's thoughts on that. Yes, Dr. Gopin?
Just 2 seconds to just be a cautionary tale here that, empathy, it's very hard to distinguish between what could stimulate empathy versus compassion, because our brain is so subtle in how it makes that distinction. And a great deal of violence in the world is based on empathy.
Yes.
It cannot be emphasized how much in the conflict zones, in the violent spaces, excessive empathy with your own group, your own family, your brother, it motivates massive violence, sometimes for a lifetime. So empathy is a very dangerous thing to play with. We think of the sociopath who could use 20 sessions with the Dalai Lama, but it's just not simple about where empathy could be taken if it's artificially stimulated, particularly if governments use it or et cetera. You could create an army of people, of empaths with their own race, that are permanently committed to violence because of their incredible empathy for their own kind. So compassion is a very subtle thing. It's much more universal. I'm skeptical that a psychopharmacological approach could make that distinction, but I'm open to the ethics of all of this, but we have to be very, very careful with this.
Dr. Rein, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so yeah, well, I mean, I'll kind of hover around that question. As I mentioned earlier, the research I'm doing is trying to identify the precise mechanism, at least in the mouse brain, of how MDMA enhances empathy. And I'll spoil that by sharing that we've found that MDMA's action in the nucleus accumbens is critical, specifically acting on serotonin release. So MDMA acts on dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and then downstream of that, many other neurotransmitters. But we found that we could replicate the effects of systemic MDMA throughout the whole body. We could find the exact same effect by simply causing serotonin release in the nucleus accumbens, which is one of the many things that MDMA does. And part of the reason that we're doing this research is because we want to know, how does MDMA work? It's a psychedelic renaissance right now. It's a hot topic in science. The other part of this is, if we can extract the useful information about what parts of MDMA are causing these pro-social experiences, then we can begin to identify potentially other compounds or other strategies that may be useful in elucidating that same response without all the other, amphetamine-like responses associated with MDMA. So now I'm honing in close to this question, which becomes, what do we do with this information? And whenever I present this research, I'm always asked that. People say, what do you think you're going to do with it? I like to joke that I think if something like that were invented, it would be great to have everyone on stage take it before a presidential debate or a political debate. I think it would solve a lot of problems. It'd be great. Let everyone really identify and understand each other's perspectives. But it's such a huge ethical question, and I'm genuinely not sure. I mean, I've begun to bridge this research with my previous studies on autism spectrum disorder as sort of a mechanistic proof of concept. We tested whether MDMA would also produce the same pro-empathic effects in a mouse model of autism spectrum disorder, and we found that it did. we also found that by just stimulating serotonin release in the nucleus accumbens without MDMA, that also produced the same effect. So we've shown that this is not only a way to enhance empathy necessarily, but to also potentially restore empathy in the context of potentially a deficit. And so there's certainly the implication there that this system in the brain is existing and can be targeted if we wanted to, or if there were systems in place to elevate empathy or restore empathy in certain contexts. But the question is whether that happens. And I absolutely agree, Dr. Ramos, that this is not my decision. This is not the decision of scientists. I think this is the decision of society. And I personally hope that systems, proper systems, can exist to allow people to make these decisions in a sort of democratic way that will also facilitate broad access if the decision is made, and not only exclusively to certain people who have the resources to access that.
The perpetual problem, right? So I want to make sure that we leave some time for questions, but before we wrap up, I just want to ask, and Dr. Klimecki, I'll take this back to you, is, given the many years of work that you've done in this area, as you kind of reflect back on your body of work, how would you like to see this turn out? What potential do you see for using this knowledge, particularly in the peace and conflict resolution field? What are you most excited about? Where do you see the most potential? And of course, anybody else who'd like to jump in on this afterwards, I'd love to hear your thoughts. But I'd like to start with you, just given your career's worth of dedication to this specific topic.
That's very kind. A topic I'm currently very excited about, and this is what I mentioned on my last slide, is the question of how can we scale this up on a systemic level, and implementing this socio-emotional education for children, so that as they are being educated, they are becoming citizens capable of sustaining peace, right? And it's already in the UN Charter that every country should be dedicated to giving every youngster this kind of education, of forming them in a peace-oriented way, living in line with all nations, all people of all ethics, all religions, and so on. But there's very little of that I find reflected in an efficient way in a lot of the educational systems. So I think one of the questions I'm currently very excited about is how can we implement that, and how do we implement it in the different contexts. And here I think this is part of a paradigm shift that we're all undergoing. Like Dr. Ramos said, it's very important to take into account as well what people on the ground say, what people in different cultures say. So we very closely work together with people in those different cultures we were working with, and ask them, like, these are the goals, and they undergo certain training, but then how they implement that and how they react to their context is really up to them, and they are the experts on their context, on their culture, and so on. So it's very interesting for me to be on that journey and to think about that. And this is, I think it would be wonderful if we could somehow scale this up in educational systems.
Thank you. Anybody else? Mark?
Well, I couldn't agree more with Dr. Klimecki. I've been thinking, part of the interventions that I do in various countries is that even in dictatorships, even in semi-authoritarian authoritarian states, there's a kind of disarmament about compassion and about training for calm and anti-anxiety. There are many, many indirect ways that we feel that if those were in the kindergarten. I always tell the story about the fact that there was a kindergarten in Damascus that was already implementing the notion, a basic political psychogeographical concept of a corner of the classroom that's for mediation. It's called Mediation Corner. And everybody's excited about it in the middle of this dictatorship, except for one of the main perpetrators of the conflict, who left in protest because he said, my child will never apologize to anyone. But in other words, this was a completely nonviolent intervention that even he couldn't stop. He was later killed. He was blown up by somebody in the war. But even he could not stop the kindergartens from having a place of empathy, compassion, relationship, perspective taking in a corner. And imagine all of those thousands of 5-year-olds who now have a psychogeography, I call it, of their minds for the rest of their lives, that there is a corner where you can take a perspective. So I think this is very insidious and subversive in a positive way, and a better way to get at conflict resolution than a lot of the methods that we've tried once the bullets are flying. And so I'm very hopeful too. I instigate it wherever I can, even in authoritarian places, and a lot of people are excited about it because everybody hates the anxiety of, of too much empathic distress. They don't like it. They want to feel better about their relationships. So there's a lot of promise here.
That's an awesome exercise, just to say. Love that.
Anybody else want to answer that before we open up to questions? Any advancements or opportunities, Dr. Ramos, Dr. Rein, that you're particularly excited about or that you're looking forward to seeing unfold?
One thing I was thinking about when Mark and Olga were going back and forth about, oh, well, Mark saying, I think that the intervention I'm using is maybe having this effect on the brain, and it would be great to study it. It was like I was watching in real time the kind of partnership that I think would be so useful. And I'm curious, like, to what extent does that exist? Because again, for the foundation, we're really interested in building those kinds of cross-disciplinary partnerships precisely for the reason you were sort of illustrating in real time, right? Because it allows you to go back and forth and think about new neuroscience studies that could be beneficial and use that to think about how you might tweak your intervention. So I'm just curious, like, is there some kind of infrastructure that allows that kind of partnership between people who are working on peace building in the field and neuroscientists who are studying that neurobiology? And if not, what might that look like?
I've been a part of, and so is my amazing colleague, Dr. Dan Rothbart. We were brought into a big study over a period of a couple of years of compassion. And there was also doctors, by the way, in biology. The biological metabolic should not be discounted here. The measurable effects on cortisol up and down by compassion versus empathy. I mean, all of this it has been done, but not to the level. I think that we need to see where the science is at about the flexibility of fMRIs and experimentation together. We need to brainstorm together and then see what's possible in the lab. And I would like to do that much, much more than we have. There's been nothing very flexible about this. It becomes these very long studies and bringing together people. And I'd rather a creative zone where we brainstorm together of what's possible. That would be great.
I think I want to mention too here that there's something pretty iterative about Mark's type of practice. And I feel like if Mark were to, write up a list of all the questions that he might ask people or the ways he might approach people, that doesn't leave that room for the actual very real kind of instant practice that I've seen from him and from other practitioners who I really admire. So I think there's something, there's particular value in that partnership being immediate and responsive in a way that we haven't, that kind of the structure of asking for money and getting money and executing doesn't really allow for that kind of iteration and responsiveness. So that's, I think, another kind of structural hurdle. Dr. Klimecki, did you want to answer Dr. Ramos? I don't want to not give you a chance. I don't know what kind of partnerships you have going on over there.
I totally agree. I mean, as we were speaking, I was thinking, gosh, it would be so exciting to actually test some of these ideas together. So I think we should really explore this very seriously in the future.
I love this. Let's walk out of Fall Peace Week with new partnerships. This is so exciting.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I just want to comment. I felt the exact same way, Dr. Ramos, that you said when that conversation was happening. I almost butted in and said, we're going to see Gopin and Klimecki at all 2024. I feel like this is really the start of a collaboration. And just to answer the question about, what sort of structures exist, I think, I've being in different academic environments, I just feel that the only thing holding back two groups from collaborating is the awareness of the one another's work and the genuine drive to work together to create something bigger. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of challenges present in academia where, you know, everyone's, you know, fighting for resources, fighting for novelty, fighting for big papers. And so, you know, with all the pressures, it's very easy to get sucked into focusing on your own work. But I think the perfect recipe for a productive collaboration is two research groups who genuinely want to make a difference. And I think that's very evident. That's what we have here. So I really hope that you two end up collaborating.
Well, it's all of us, because I recognize the science education communication piece of this that you've emphasized in translating the very technical work you do to the public. That's essential for the brain transformations we're talking about, because so much of science puts people off, makes them feel stupid. And when you can find the right language to give them power over their minds, which Seligman is working on a lot too, is that this is very transformational moment. And it's something we're all committed here to a new kind of science education that may make the drugs less essential. We may be able to be on the cusp of a much more effective psychopharmacology through the work we do and the testing we do with fMRIs and others on the effects.
Yeah,
If I'm go ahead. If I'm to this, I also think that your work on MDMA and the potential effects it can have on social relationships, and checking that in with fMRI, also with brain functions, that might also be extremely exciting, right? So there's a lot of potential, I think. Yeah.
Well, I'm certainly open to that collaboration. That sounds amazing. But I just want to add that, you know, just in case there's any uncertainty, I do want to make it clear that my intention with this research is certainly not to create some drug to enhance empathy. My intention is purely on the mechanistic side. I mean, like I said, I've always been curious about this continuum of social behavior. You know, we all kind of hover in the middle, or most of us, and you know, in the context of something like autism spectrum disorder, what sort of brain changes are occurring that lead to these changes in social behavior? And then on the other side, you know, this MDMA is such a powerful drug, one of the few substances in the world that has the ability to evoke such pro-social emotions and this connectedness. And so I have this natural curiosity about what are the mechanisms there as well? Are they the same mechanisms that are potentially disrupted on the other side? And so it's really mechanistic exploration. And I like to note as frequently as I can that I do not have any evil plan to take over the world with drugs and make everyone more empathic.
Did you see yourself in a position as a young scientist where you'd be making that disclaimer on the regular?
No, I certainly did not.
Right?
No.
Khara, did you want to say something before we open up to questions?
Yeah. Just, you know, I think Ben, you were saying that a big reason why maybe this collaboration hadn't happened before was just a lack of awareness of each other. But I think another roadblock to the kind of collaboration that we're sort of watching happen in real time here is funding. So that's one of the reasons why I moved to philanthropy from the federal government, because philanthropy can fund really novel types of work. And what you're talking about here is exactly that. You know, I don't know what federal agency would want to fund the potential partnership that is budding here, but I wish they would. And you know, I think that philanthropy can really support new models for doing science in a societally embedded way. And that's exactly what the Dana Foundation wants to do. So, you know, I think that that's partly why I was asking if that kind of infrastructure exists, because I think what you need, as you were saying, maybe Mark, you were saying this is, or Kristen, you were saying this, not just the opportunity to, you know, meet and collaborate from afar, but potentially to be like working alongside each other and having that frequent iterative touch point kind of capability. And we have some really big grants that we're going to announce this fall that are going to be supporting exactly that, like catalytic hubs for neuroscience that's being done with community partners that are like part and parcel of the science enterprise in a way that I think has never been done before. And I'm so excited for people to see this, because I just think that it's an example of what science could look like, you know, to actually really be beneficial for society and reflect what society needs in this case. Like you were saying, Olga, what is the experience on the ground of actually trying to operationalize what you're seeing in your research? So I just wanted to mention that because I think the funding is a really important piece here.
I'm just guessing, but I think you mentioning funding is welcome by everyone on this
Right.
panel. We're going to put any time. So we only have a couple minutes left, but I do want to open up to questions. I'm going to ask our host to allow participants to come off mute. And I have to start with Dan, of course. I'd love to hear your thoughts and what you have to ask.
This is such an exciting conversation. I have so many questions. I want to go back to Dr. Ramos's really compelling set of questions about neurointervention, the morality of it, and kind of scale up to situate those questions within the bigger picture of peace building. So my view, and I think my colleague Mark Open would agree, peace building is all about transformation that's morally informed and driven. And this transformation obviously is at multiple levels: individual, obviously psychic, but also social and political. So to some degree, it's always been a little bit subversive. It's always been, I mean, what is totally not, which I love that image that Mark Open just gave. I always feel kind of like, am I manipulating people? Am I manipulating my students? Am I kind of setting, even the context of study abroad programs, which Mark Open obviously champions and has brought so much positive impact. To some degree, that's subversive, Mark, in obviously morally informed way. So I think all of what, and the analogies to healthcare are obvious. Preventative healthcare, isn't that subversive? In terms of educating parents, there's so many areas. The placebo effect, I mean, is that ethical? And so I think, yes, Dr. Ramos's points are absolutely right on, and yet it's not the only area of peace building that is facing this, and we still move on in peace building. I want to be subversive, but recognize the key distinction that Dr. Ramos, I think, mentioned is between the conscious awareness of everything, like informed consent, obviously, those type of, very morally informed kind of processes, versus unconscious kind of uninformed manipulation. I mean, that's a key ethical distinction. But anyway, so thank you for raising those points, Dr. Ramos.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for coming today. Aviva?
Hi, thank you so much for organizing this today. This has been so helpful for me. I'm particularly passionate about science education, specifically neuroscience, human flourishing, and peace building. I was curious about this one idea. So I don't know if you guys have heard of Optimal Work, which was founded by Dr. Kevin Majors outside of Harvard's Human Flourishing Institute. But they already we provide educational resources for human flourishing and social bonding through the tenets of reframing, mindfulness, and challenge. And we're already working with executive teams of several companies across industries, working with faculty and students at universities, and we're helping design school curricula. Do you think that this or something like this could be used in peace building processes?
I don't know who might want to take that.
Maybe I can start. Yes, down the line. A lot of the work we're doing in the lab or in early studies is very particular. The more and more we find that some effects are maybe not replicable. So maybe there are some effects that we find in the laboratory in Switzerland that we might not find in 10 other countries we would test this in, right? So before scaling this up on a political level, we need to be doing a lot of comparative studies where we implement certain things that we find to be efficient maybe in first studies across several studies. So this is one of the ways that we're moving now. So we're running multi-country studies to check are there any country differences and so on. And then once we find that there's kind of a certain cross-cultural pattern, maybe it works in some contexts, not in others, then we can move the next step of scaling things up. But the science is still far away from giving very, very clear recommendations to politicians, unfortunately. And I hope that by the end of my career, I will see that, but I think we still have some decades to go here.
Fair enough.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, I just want to mention, Aviva, very, very good question. I'm thrilled that you're doing the work. One cautionary note to everybody going forward is that we're in peace building and conflict resolution. We recognize that most conflicts are asymmetric. There are various grievances that look from different perspectives, sometimes the group, sometimes gender, where there's asymmetries that are very severe. When you come in with a lot of happy, positive psychology stuff, it's perceived as a pacification, as an avoidance of the key justice issues. So we have to be very careful with this. I never go into a conflict zone, advocating this as a part of reaching your enemies, because people are embedded in very severe, dangerous situations. It's more indirect than that. So we have to be very careful to not become part of apologetic processes of pacification, and at the same time offer the healing that this can bring to everybody on all sides of a conflict or coping with disastrous situations. And that, I think, is more globally fundable eventually by the major agencies. But if you get right into the conflict with this and say, this is the solution to the conflict, you're going to be slammed by
Do you
all
think
sides.
do you think focusing on resilience would be it? Because that is our focus. And do you think that would help as in terms of indirect interventions, just helping grow resiliency and self-mastery and strengthening one's agency?
Well, my experience with warriors is that you have to be really, really negotiate the language of what they're able to accept. I never did conflict resolution in Syria. I only did public relations, they called what I was doing. So, every word is has to be negotiated, because every word has a different implication, politically, militarily, etc. And what we're doing here is trying to move into an area of helping people without threat and without necessarily, without threat and without threat to their identity. So this is a very complicated thing.
Yeah.
And I think it has to be negotiated with each space that you're in.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is very helpful.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. So we're right at time. If anybody has anything they'd like to say as we wrap up, I'd be happy to hear from you. I'll give you a chance to raise your hands. Otherwise, okay. Well, we've been asked to end on time, and we're going to end exactly on time. So thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and for listening to one another, and hopefully building the beginnings of a new partnership as part of this year's Peace Week. I appreciated all of your attendance and loved everything that you had to say, and I'm excited about what comes next. So hope you all have a wonderful Friday. Hope you enjoy the remaining sessions if you're attending today. And I hope to be in touch with all of you very soon. Thank you so much.